Hi, welcome to this presentation on questions and hypotheses in science. We'll be talking about questions and hypotheses in this unit as part of IB Criterion B, and we'll be assessing these skills at the end of the unit. So this video is meant as a resource for you to learn a little bit about questions and hypotheses, and also so that you can use those skills in your bottle biology experiment as well as other experiments that we do in this unit and in the course. Now, asking questions and collecting data to answer them is basically what scientists do. And I wanted to start off with an example of a really famous experiment. You'll see on the left there, there's a picture of a pelican sitting on some mangroves. And mangroves are these trees that grow basically in the shallow water of the ocean in different parts of the world. Now, these happen to be in Florida, and they form these little islands. Now, some of the islands are relatively big compared to others, and some of them are very close to the shore, and some of them are relatively far away. So these two scientists set out to find out what difference the size of the island and its distance from the mainland might make in terms of the number of species of insects and other organisms that they find on those islands. And so what they did is they covered up a whole bunch of these islands with plastic, and they actually fumigated them. They put a pesticide in there to kill off everything that lived on the island, except for the mangroves. And then they took the coverings off and let it sit for a while and came back periodically to find out how many species live there. And what they found out is that the larger the island was, the more species there were, but also the farther away the island was from the mainland, the fewer species there were. So a really large island that's very close to the mainland would have the highest species, whereas a very small island that's far away would have the least. And this finding has been supported in other research as well, and is called the theory of island biogeography. Now, you don't have to remember that per se, but we're just going to use that example. And you might wonder, well, why is the theory of island biogeography important? Well, it's really important in ecology for thinking for conservation, because what we find out is it's not just mangrove swamps in Florida that follow this pattern, but anytime we have habitats or patches of habitats that are separate from each other, and we can see the example here of clear-cut logging, what we've done essentially is created a bunch of virtual islands. Even though they're on land and they're in a forest and they're not out in the ocean, they're not mangroves, right? They're all these little islands of habitat. And so the question is, how does that affect the number of species that live in each of those areas? Now, we could take on the role of an ecologist working for, say, the Wood River Land Trust, and think about this question, that in the Wood River Valley, should the Wood River Land Trust focus on conserving numerous small blocks of habitat all along the river, so little chunks here and there all up and down the valley, or should they try to purchase land in just a few larger blocks to try to make big pieces of land that's protected and that are closer together? So this would be the question or this would be sort of the problem that they might be looking at, and as an ecologist I might go out and try to investigate this problem. So first thing I'm going to have to do is develop a more clear scientific question. Now, a good science question has really three main characteristics. One is it's relevant, which means that it actually matters in some kind of way to somebody. Secondly is the question is specific, so it's not a very general question. In fact, it even includes specific variables that I might test in a scientific experiment. And then lastly, it is a testable question. It's something I can actually go out and collect data about. So let's look at some examples here of questions. How many organisms are affected by garbage? Let's just take a moment to think about, is that a relevant question? Well, it could be, especially for a group maybe trying to do ocean conservation or who are trying to understand issues of pollution in the ocean. Is it a specific question? Probably not. We're not really saying what kind of organisms we're looking at, just organisms, any kind of living thing. And we're saying affected by garbage, but what does that mean, affected by it? Do we mean, how does garbage affect their reproductive rates? How does it affect the biodiversity or number of species in an area? How does it affect how fast they grow? Or how does it affect their behavior? We don't really know. The question doesn't answer that, address those things. How about this one? Is cola the best kind of pop? Take a moment and think. Is this a relevant question? Is this a specific question? And is this testable? To me, this is the kind of question that would be in some ways hard to test unless we define what we mean by best. So best meaning has the most calories, is ranked the most flavorful by people who drink it, is chosen over other kinds of soda when people are given different kinds of soda to try. We don't really know from the question what exactly we'd be testing here, but maybe it could be changed in some way. We might also wonder if it's relevant. Now, if I were a soft drink company like Coca-Cola, then I might be conducting these kind of experiments to find out what people like. So then it might be a relevant question. Here's one more. Why are obesity rates on the rise in America? Now you can see the little graph there. It shows obesity rates going up and up. And you might think, well, yeah, that's a great scientific question. Something about obesity rates. But the trick here is the word why. Can we test why are they going up? Well, that would be pretty difficult. We could test some specific possible cause. So we could look at our obesity rates higher in areas that have a higher concentration of fast food restaurants, or our obesity rates higher in certain parts of the country versus another. But if we want to address the question of why are they getting higher, then we're really getting into more of explanation rather than something we can specifically test. So this is an interesting question. It could be really relevant to lots of different groups, and there might be ways we could test factors that affect obesity, but we can't really test why they're going up. We can simply collect data and maybe try to explain why those factors might cause a rise in obesity. For example, fast food restaurants. If there's a lot of fast food restaurants, and fast food restaurants have a lot of high-fat food and people are eating a lot of that, then maybe that causes increases in the obesity rate. So here's a question we might ask if we're that ecologist working for the Wood River Land Trust. We might ask, does the size of undeveloped blocks of land in the riparian corridor, which means along the river, affect the species richness of annual plants in the Wood River Valley? Now, by species richness, that's just a measure of biodiversity, and I'm talking about the diversity or number of different species of annual plants, I'm trying to be specific there, in the Wood River Valley. So this is something I could test. I could go out and find areas of different sizes. I could count the number of species in those areas, and then I could see if there's a relationship. This would be relevant to the land trust because they're trying to find out if they should acquire big blocks of land or lots of smaller pieces of land. And my variables are also right there in the question, the size of the land, blocks of land, and species richness, which is a specific thing that I can measure. Now, another part of the criterion says that you need to explain the question or problem, and by explain it, what we basically mean is saying why it's relevant to our goal or audience. And we just did that. This question here about the Wood River Valley, picture you see on the left, and the Wood River Land Trust is our audience, so they're the ones that might be interested in our findings. So we have to make sure we're asking a question that actually fits their needs in this case. After we have our question, then we'd be developing our hypothesis. And a hypothesis is often stated by students as being an educated guess, but the key there is really that idea of educated. It's not really a guess. It's a prediction that's based on something that's known in science. So we have to, in some kind of way, justify our hypothesis. So here I wrote, if the Wood River Land Trust purchases larger pieces of land, then they will achieve a higher species richness and provide a greater benefit for the conservation of biodiversity in the Wood River Valley compared to a strategy of purchasing smaller pieces of land. So my hypothesis is that it would be better for them to purchase big pieces of land that are close together rather than a bunch of scattered little pieces. Now that's not just a guess, that's not just something I'm saying. I'm predicting that based on my knowledge of island biogeography, which is what we started with. Which states that larger islands that are closer to a mainland are going to have higher species diversity than those that are small and far away. So I'm using that same logic here by saying if we have these undeveloped blocks of land and they're larger and they're closer together, that we'll have more species in those conservation areas. So my scientific reasoning then is basically just using one of those scientific principles or ideas to explain a set of observations or to make a prediction in the case of a hypothesis. So this is what I mean by not just guessing. I actually have to use something scientific that's an established scientific idea upon which to base my prediction. So here it says the theory of island biogeography states that species richness on a small, isolated island will be lower than a larger, less isolated island. This is because few species are able to find and immigrate to an isolated island, and because islands of small size usually have fewer habitat types, limiting the number of species that can survive on the island. Therefore, the maximum benefit to the Wood River Land Trust would be gained by purchasing land that is concentrated in large blocks and close together rather than small, isolated patches. So there's my use of scientific reasoning to back up my prediction or my hypothesis. So in summary, we can think about asking good scientific questions, and we can always ask ourselves, is this question relevant somehow to my audience and to my goal? Is it specific, and does it actually state what the variables would be that I can test? And then lastly, is it a testable question? Could I actually go out and collect some data in some way? If that's not the case, then it's not a very good scientific question. It's more of a maybe philosophical question, a question about beliefs or ideas rather than a question to be investigated in science. For a hypothesis then, what I'm doing is I'm predicting the relationship between the variables. And a hypothesis often uses that if-then format. So in the example I gave, I said if they purchase the larger blocks, then I would expect there to be higher species richness. That's a good way to do it. And then lastly, this idea of justifying that hypothesis using scientific reasoning. And scientific reasoning just means that you're using or applying a scientific principle or theory in order to explain something. You're not just guessing, you're actually using some knowledge that you have and trying to predict based on what you already know and in a logical way. So I hope this presentation is helpful, and I look forward to working with you in practicing these skills as we go through the unit. Thanks.